The cabin lights glowed softly as passengers shuffled to their seats, overhead bins clicking shut and the low hum of conversation filling the air. Among them was a man in his late 30s, his clothes plain, his eyes carrying the weight of years that had tested him far more than most could imagine. He slid quietly into seat 12F, the window seat, pulling down the armrest as though it might shield him from the curious eyes of others. He wasn't extraordinary to look at, just another weary traveler, a single dad clutching a worn backpack and a folded drawing his little daughter had given him before the flight. What no one around him knew was that hidden behind his quiet presence, behind the scars of struggle and solitude, lay a history and a call sign that could silence a room, a call sign that would soon bring even the most disciplined F-22 fighter pilots to stand at attention in awe. And before we dive deeper into this story, let me ask you something. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the truth that every person carries a story worth knowing, then please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Echo Tales. Your support helps us bring powerful stories like this one to life. He leaned back in his seat, his face pressed briefly against the window as the plane taxied. To the flight attendants and other passengers, he was invisible, a man with the look of someone who had been overlooked too many times in his life. The flight attendants gave their rehearsed smiles, the business travelers scrolled through their phones, and children tugged at their parents' sleeves impatiently. For him, this anonymity was familiar. As a janitor back home, as a single father raising his daughter on a shoestring budget, he had spent years being unseen. But beneath his quiet demeanor was a past no one would suspect. A past lived in the skies, marked by precision, courage, and call signs whispered with respect in the halls of air bases. As the flight lifted into the clouds, he closed his eyes and thought of his daughter. She was his reason, the only anchor in a life that had been storm after storm. Her smile kept him moving when exhaustion weighed him down. Her laughter was the single melody that could lift the darkness that followed him. What she didn't fully know, because he had never been able to tell her the whole story, was that he hadn't always been a janitor. Once he had been something else, someone others had relied on, a protector of skies, a name that even the mightiest pilots carried in their memory like a legend. But war and loss had stripped it all away, leaving him to rebuild life from ashes, starting over with nothing but the determination to give his little girl a life better than his own. The hum of the engines was interrupted when turbulence shook the cabin. People gasped, hands gripped armrests, and nervous glances darted toward the crew. He remained still, steady, almost calm. It wasn't the calm of ignorance, but of experience. He had faced storms fiercer than this, skies more violent than these. He knew turbulence was fleeting, but his stillness drew the quiet attention of the man beside him, a businessman who looked nervously around, trying to gauge whether they were in danger. The quiet dad in 12F simply kept his gaze steady, his breathing even, his hand still resting on the drawing his daughter had given him. It was as though he was anchored by something greater, as though the air itself was a language he had once spoken fluently. Hours into the flight, an announcement crackled over the intercom that startled everyone. Unusual airspace restrictions meant the commercial jet would soon be accompanied by U.S. Air Force fighters until it cleared a specific zone. The cabin filled with nervous murmurs. It was an unusual procedure, and passengers craned their necks to glimpse the sleek shadows of F-22 Raptors cutting through the sky alongside them. For most, it was a thrill mixed with unease. But for the quiet man in seat 12F, it was something else entirely. His pulse quickened, his eyes narrowed, and the past began to resurface in ways he had buried for years. Because he knew those jets not as distant figures of power, but as brothers, comrades, and once, as wings that had carried his call sign across the skies. A murmur passed through the rows when the pilot's voice came over again, requesting someone by a very specific call sign to identify themselves. At first, the passengers looked confused. What was a call sign and why would it matter here? But in seat 12F, the man froze. It was his. That call sign, spoken aloud across the cabin, was his name in another life, a name he thought would never be spoken again outside the walls of a base. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he raised his hand, his quiet voice confirming it. The cabin erupted. In whispers, confusion spreading like wildfire. People turned to stare at him as though a stranger had suddenly unmasked himself before their very eyes. Within moments, the F-22 pilots outside banked closer, dipping their wings in a gesture no civilian on that flight had ever witnessed. For those in the know, it was a salute, an honor reserved for only the most respected among them. The passengers gaped, their jaws slack, as the reality sank in. The quiet janitor, the weary single dad, the man who had slipped unnoticed into seat 12F was someone far more than they could have ever imagined. He was a name carved into the skies, a man whose leadership and courage had once saved lives at altitudes most people would never dream of reaching. The applause began hesitantly, then grew into a wave that filled the cabin. The man sat humbled, eyes glistening, not for the recognition, but for the thought of his daughter. Because now, perhaps when she grew older, she would know that her father had been more than just the man who cleaned floors to keep food on their table. He had been a protector, a warrior of the skies, and though he had chosen silence, the truth had finally found him again. And dear viewers, if this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you that every person carries a history that the world may not see at first glance, please take a moment to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel Echo Tales. Your support allows stories like this to inspire and move hearts everywhere. Special request. Before this video ends, I ask you to leave a comment below. Share with us what this story made you feel, or if you've ever met someone whose quiet presence hid a history far greater than anyone could guess. Your words may inspire others, just as this story has inspired us all.